right, so it seems as though the waiting room has slowed down. Maddie, if you want to start recording, and I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. All right, recording's going. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Maddy Bifano. I'll be moderating our discussion today, which is residential school artwork conversations. So we're really looking forward to discussing this with everybody. Storm and Krista would like to introduce themselves. We could get going.
So I'm Krista McCracken. I'm the researcher and curator at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre in Sault Ste. Marie, also known as Bawating, on Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, the homelands of the Anishinaabe and Métis peoples.
And hello, I'm Skylee-Storm. I am living and working on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, Ontario. I currently work with No History, which is a historical research services firm. I used to work with Krista and Maddy at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre for about 4 or 5 years. I'm originally from the GTA, as well as my father's from the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, which is unceded territory near Montreal, Quebec.
Okay, so now we've got our introductions underway. Sorry, there we go. We'll start off with kind of a beginning question here just to start everything going. So can you share your experiences working with art that was made by residential school students?
Sure. I guess I can go first and then I'll turn it over to Storm. So the photo on the screen is one example from a scrapbook or sketchbook that was compiled by a staff member at the Shingwauk Residential School. And it's held in the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. And my first kind of interaction with it was back in 2010 when I first started working at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. So both the scrapbook as well as some handicrafts or small objects made by students were part of the Shingwauk holdings, but hadn't been accessioned or described. They had been put on display previously, but there wasn't a lot of contextual information around them. So some of my first experiences were coming across these items in the collection and trying to piece out like the historical context behind them, as well as how to accession and describe them based on archival practices, but also based on community needs and what would work best for this type of materials.
I also worked with them while I was working in the center with Krista. I often came across them when I was preparing to do displays or when I was renaming and reorganizing collections. Is we had a big reorganization project going on because prior, a lot of the records had been described and accessioned in relation to the staff or the residential school principals. And we were kind of minded that we wanted to rename some of the file descriptions and kind of reorganize them in a way that was more accessible to survivors and their families. So a lot of what I did was coming across photos by chance usually, or coming across pieces of art by chance when I was doing that reaccessioning work. So the photo that's on the screen, there's actually a few different film photos that look very similar to this one. So I would often kind of make connections like that. There were also 2 photographs from classes or clubs where people had taken candid photographs of students making handicrafts or drawing or painting while they were in school, and kind of making those contextual connections with the actual objects. And for creating displays, I had to do some research on why those things were created and kind of how they were used within the residential school context. So whether they were a part of the curriculum, and were kind of based off of something that the residential school wanted to teach, or whether or not those things were for sale in support of the running and operations of the residential school.
Okay, and could you describe how you care for this type of material, like culturally preserving wise, any ways like that?
Yeah, and I think this is a really kind of complicated question that dives into kind of the heart of the topic for today is how do you care for artwork that was made in the context of a colonial system, and that how the Shingwauk Residential School Centre came to get this artwork. It was donated by a staff member. So thinking about consent and ownership of this material by the students who may not have known that this artwork was being kept by instructors, or what it was going to be used for later on. And so a lot of it has been conversations with survivors and intergenerational survivors about the care and use of this material and making sure that it's preserved and displayed in a respectful way. Storm, I don't know if you want to share some specific examples. I know working with, for example, the owl pieces was one that the conversations around care came up.
Yeah, actually, because while I was working in the residential school, I was also a student at Algoma University, which is housed in the former Shingwauk Residential School. So being in Indigenous Studies courses myself, because I was interested in learning more about the Anishinaabe, from my Mohawk perspective, I had made some friends with folks who were intergenerational survivors or descendants of residential school students. And a large proportion of them were related to people that we have artifacts or documents in our collections, photographs in our collections of. And Harvey Owl's collection, I was contacted by a descendant who I know in the community. And the family was interested in how these materials were being cared for, whether or not they could get copies or if they could take the materials themselves. And I know having discussions and looking at like the mandates of the residential school center, we were more than happy because we do have high resolution copies of these artworks to hand them over to the families. But after some discussion of who would be able to care for them and where they would be stored, and with which family member, the family decided it was better off that they'd stay with us for the time being until they were comfortable with taking them. And we offered to give them copies of the artworks and directed them to where the high resolution copies were online. I'd even asked the family if they were okay with these being displayed, or like being able to be accessed. And they were quite happy with it because they remember Harvey as being quite talented at art and very proud of the art that he created while he was in residential school, but they actually had no idea, and he actually passed on without knowing that his art had been preserved or kept. He wasn't sure what happened to it after he handed it in or after it was taken away from him by teachers.
And I just returned to this slide because this is one of the sketches done by Harvey that Storm was just talking about, as is the one here that's of the residential school itself. So that being the Shingwauk Residential School, and this photo here being kind of a view, it's titled like a view from my window. So it would have been from the dormitory space at Shingwauk. The other sketches that Harvey did, there's a lot around sports, is like the hockey image. There's just a huge range. And I think it's really interesting that looking at this scrapbook of material, how many were done by him as an individual. There's artwork from other students as well, but there's an overwhelming number that are related to Harvey Owl and the Owl family specifically.
So just to respond to the chat, the artworks are now stored at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre archives. So they're archivally stored in the holdings, in like folders and things of that nature, and they're cared for at the building.
Yeah, if there's other questions in the chat, just let me know. Just with the screen share, I can't see them.
And I'm not sure if that's George Armstrong. I'm not really great at sports.
Yeah, my hockey knowledge is not perfect.
It was answered in the chat. It's Sil Apps, and it's actually labeled right on the drawing.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Oh, perfect.
figured that one out. We did it.
My dad's super disappointed right now.
I don't know if we want to talk a little bit around the ethics of sharing this material. Like, obviously, we're sharing them right now. Some of these have been on display, and just kind of the process behind making sure they're displayed in a good way. And I think part of it is really contextualizing the artwork. So making it clear the context in which it was created. So yes, it is student artwork. It's beautiful artwork in many cases, but recognizing that it happened in the context of the residential school system, I think is really important. Simply just displaying the images without any context, I don't think does the history of them and the meaning behind them any justice. Storm, do you have thoughts on like the display and use of the item, the artwork specifically?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them that aren't a part of the Harvey collection, it was hard to determine who created the art unless it was signed. The teachers who had kept and the staff who had kept the artworks would often put them in photo albums or scrapbooks or just in collections of papers without really too much context. A lot of the themes of the artwork, of course, look like, you know, it could be related to some form of the curriculum, or it could be related to techniques learned in art classes. But I think it's important when looking at the context of where and when that these were created, that it was during periods of difficulties for a lot of these students, because a lot of the stories that we've heard from current living survivors about the periods of time in which these artworks were created were some difficult stories. And it's important to realize that if you just display these without that context or without the knowledge that these students were facing different lived experiences at this time, it can leave the impression that this was fun. For a lot of students, yes, this may have been like a highlight or like something fun that they got to do for self-expression or working with their hands, especially in the case of the wooden handicrafts. It would have been something similar to what they would have done had they not been in residential schools, in the fact that they're using their hands and they're creating something with wood, with natural mediums. But under the context of, you know, these things are now the property of your instructor, or these things are now taken from you because you don't even belong to you, like you don't have your own agency. I think that that's something very important to keep in mind when displaying these items. And I think it's very important too that when a survivor or a family descendant or intergenerational survivor brings it forward to you that these items, you know, either trigger them or they know something about these items that wasn't captured in the context of your collection, I think it's really important to incorporate that knowledge or incorporate the suggestions from the community in how you care for and display those items.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And when you were talking about how, you know, it may have been a bright part, or you displaying these might make you think that, you know, it wasn't that bad. It really got me thinking about images and photography around residential schools generally and how that can have a similar effect, and just the need to contextualize everything connected to residential schools, because the fact that the artifacts and artwork don't necessarily tell the full story.
There's a question in the chat. Have you received any artwork made at residential schools from survivors directly, or are they all from former teachers and administration?
So we've received, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 pieces of artwork that were from survivors directly, but the rest has been from staff or administration. So I don't know if we want to shift a little to talk a bit about artwork beyond sketches. So thinking about things that were built or carved or stitched at residential schools.
Yeah, I think that that was kind of a little bit more of a different experience than the sketches. The sketches look like they were done either in connection to themed curriculum or and to what the students' interests were, or like art training of some type, similar to like a high school or elementary school art class. However, woodwork I found was more utilitarian, or it was based more off of instruction directly than the more freed sketches that we have in the collection. Even just looking at this image here, I believe that this was like some type of open house or like a display to the community, kind of showing the outside community how they were training the students in more like practical work skills. And I mean, too, these things would have served some type of function or would have been for sale to the wider community to support the residential school. So it was almost like a form of free labor that would generate revenue for residential schools to further stay open or like pay for certain things that maybe that the government or church didn't pay for.
I think that becomes even more apparent when you look at, say, an image like this, where you get, similar to the last one, multiples of the same item made, and see how it's very formulaic in what students were creating. You can also see like the commercialization of Indigenous art and just Indigenous craft happening.
Yeah, I think that these ones, because I have handled these a couple times, because a few of them did remain in our collection, that I found it interesting at first that they had chosen totem poles. They'd chosen these very simple like wooden knives, and I believe a couple other things like feathers. But it kind of it feeds into this conditioning and assimilative concept of a pan-Indigenous identity. Because Shingwauk had students from a lot of different areas. It had students from the James Bay area. It had students from, you know, Mohawk territories. It had students from, yeah, exactly, from Southwestern Ontario, as well as, you know, Central and Northern Ontario. I believe there were even some students from Quebec who were sent to Shingwauk in the early days. So, I mean, you're seeing a lot of different individual Indigenous cultures here, and none of them have totem poles as far as I've been able to see in any time spent with other cultures besides Mohawk. And I know for sure we don't have totem poles. So, I mean, their choices of what they had the students create were really rooted in the settler ideal of what Indigenous culture is and what represents Indigenous people. And oftentimes that wasn't a true representation of the individual cultures that these students came from. And it attributed as well to the further concepts of pan-Indigeneity. When these students left school, they had a very different concept or understanding of who they are and what is a part of their culture than they would have had if they had stayed within their communities.
I think in particular, looking at these carvings, we know that some of them were created specifically around 1967, and so that being the centennial of Canada. And in Sault Ste. Marie, they held what they called an Indian Expo, and a lot of it was displaying work done by the Shingwauk Residential School students, and very much feeding into pan-Indianism or pan-Indigenous ideals and what that looked like in the 60s. And then these items were sold for profit in the Sault Ste. Marie community, which kind of puts a whole different lens on them, that they were sold versus kept by a teacher or as part of a classroom assignment.
Yeah, and I think too, when we display things like these, it's important. I've had a lot of questions when we've had these displayed from people, you know, of like non-Indigenous visitors or people who would pass by the displays would often ask me like, oh, I thought they weren't allowed to access their culture while they were in residential school. And I was just like, you know, this isn't their culture. And kind of answering those questions made us realize often that we needed to include that context of showing them on display for sale, as well as students creating them in woodshop. A few of those photos exist, because the context needed to be there for non-Indigenous folks who don't have a understanding of the different cultures and the ideas of why these things were made. Whereas Indigenous visitors and folks who would be viewing this would, you know, they would understand that this was not necessarily an activity for the students. It was an activity for the profit of the school. So a question in the chat is, would this artwork be stamped Shingwauk and or signed by the creators? Actually, no. A lot of this material, if it was stamped Shingwauk, it would be written kind of in pen, pencil, or marker. And it wouldn't be signed by the students because it was often created for sale. So they didn't want individual students signing it. And it was really kind of like an assembly line. Like they were all creating the same uniform item and trying not to be too unique with it.
Yeah, and I think we have almost 60 of these small items that were made by students. So a range of wood carvings, weavings, resin molds, kind of a mixture of mediums. But of them, maybe 2 have student initials on them, and that's it. And very few of them have any maker's marks on them at all.
Yeah, I was thinking actually specifically when I mentioned the knife, I was thinking of that knife that's actually displayed there. I found that fairly interesting. And then also too, I remember just unwrapping it and being like, oh, the face is painted red. And just being kind of upset about that. Also too, I really liked those bird pins that are displayed on the bottom of the screen. There's a few different variations of the birds. Some of them are done in the exact same shape style, but they're painted slightly different to represent like a different species of bird. And I found that those were pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for context around this, the items that we do have that were created in this time period, so 50s, 60s, the ones that are now held by the Shingwauk Residential School Centre were donated by a person who was the woodworking teacher, and anything that wasn't sold or taken from the woodworking shop he kept. And then once the Shingwauk Residential School Centre archive opened, he donated them to the residential school center. But in many cases, for example, the bird brooches in particular, there's the wood finished product, but we also have the templates. So you can see kind of how mass produced they are. In many cases, there's both like cardboard templates or there's metal templates that would have been used so that all of them were very similar or almost identical when they were created. which I think speaks to kind of the mass producing piece that Storm was talking about earlier.
These ones specifically, I've never actually had anybody, aside from survivors themselves, reach out about these materials. And I think that that kind of speaks to the fact that these weren't as personally connected as the drawings were. I know that some of the survivors had mentioned to me that they remember woodshop and they remember making things, but it was kind of a blur, or like a lot of those things kind of blended together because they were following templates or like very formal instructions. But the drawings are the ones that I think we received the most personal connection and like personal stories from, just because, I mean, there was a different level of creativity involved with those pieces, I think, than these. And I think too that it feeds into a wider discussion of how much art is out in the communities near former residential schools that was created by residential school students, and that history or that context had been lost by the people whose families had purchased it. Just because I know that the wider Sault Ste. Marie area probably has quite a bit of art in their possession where like they know that an Indigenous person had made it, but they don't know necessarily that their ancestor had bought it from a residential school. Just because I know that I've had even people on tours who are in their 60s who say to me like, oh, I had no idea there's a residential school here. So I'd often think to myself, well, they probably have in their possession a lot of these craft sale arts, or even in the thrift market, there's probably some of the craft sale arts in circulation.
I'd say likewise the furniture pieces that, like, for example, these small little tables, those were definitely sold to the Sault Ste. Marie community. Likewise, a lot of the furniture inside the residential school, any of the wood furniture, was made by the students. And when Algoma University College moved into the residential school building in 1971, a lot of that just went up for sale and was bought by local families. So I think you're definitely right that there is a lot of items that were made in the residential school that are likely out in the Algoma region or the Sault Ste. Marie region.
There's another question in the chat. Do you know where or how this art was sold? Were there markets or stores that could be researched?
Yeah, so in most cases it was sold kind of like church bazaar type spaces, or at special events where they invited people into the residential school. So this photo is actually taken in what was the auditorium, and it was for an event where they invited community in to see some of the work students were doing and to purchase it.
I think that there could be some research done about the different craft sale events, like the one that took place at the Sioux Armories for the centennial, as well as some of the ones that were done via the church. Like probably you could go through correspondence and determine when some of these bazaars were held, if there was a record kept of them. But as for like individual purchasers, I think that that would be a much harder task. I'm not sure if they kept records or decent records of who had purchased artworks, and that would be an interesting thing to kind of delve into and reach out to the wider community about, if folks had stories about their parents or grandparents purchasing these items. Just because I don't really think that they kept any records of who they sold them to, or all of the sales even that were involved. I know too that a lot of the furniture in the residential school was made by students, and that kind of feeds into the wider discussion of kind of that idea of government or church provided education for Indigenous peoples. I think that a lot of the discussion doesn't include the fact that, you know, students are still involved really in providing for themselves, even though, you know, they were under the supposed care of these institutions. They still had to, you know, do a lot of the cooking. Needlework was mentioned earlier, and that fed into a lot of seamstress classes where students had to fix other students' uniforms and clothes. Survivor Shirley Horn, she talks about darning socks all the time, and that it's like her super talent because that's what she had to do all of the time. And there's this connection to crafting as something that leaves enjoyment and really becomes something that's utilitarian and something that serves a purpose rather than to be art.
So I might,
Oh, go ahead, Krista.
oh, I was gonna say, I might stop screen sharing and then we can open it up to more of a dialogue, if that's okay.
That's an interesting comment, Catherine, that your mother first was taught how to knit socks and gloves for the armed forces who were in the Second World War. Because I actually have read recently some letters and correspondence from soldiers in the First and Second World Wars who had received items from these knitters clubs or from church knitting organizations. And I'm curious how many of those utilized residential school labor. That would be something very interesting to look into.
Yeah, my mother actually, that became her passion. And I said that it was really interesting because it was, she was in a Catholic residential school, and she in Saskatchewan, and she was taught to sort of knit, not from a pattern, but from this is how you do the socks, and you knit them so many inches long for such and such a size, and then you turn the heel and that sort of thing. Same with the gloves, right? You knit them so many stitches across and so fingers so long for the size. And so she actually, that became her passion. And I still have, she's gone now, unfortunately. She died quite young, but I have some sweaters and things that she knit for me that, aside from sort of knowing the basic structure of it, she did all her own designs and stuff. So that, listening to this, that really became her artwork, was out of this residential school experience. She learned to knit, and then she took it forward, and it actually helped her make a living because people would commission sweaters from her and stuff. So yeah, this has been very touching, just looking at these things.
Thank you for
Thank you so
sharing.
much.
Yeah, I've had other survivors talk to me just kind of candidly about how they utilized a lot of those types of skills when they left, because I mean, you were kind of just told like, okay, pack up, like you're 16 now, time to go. And for a lot of the women, seamstress jobs were easy to pick up wherever they moved, and it was something that they could easily do on the side if they couldn't get a clerical job or like a typing job or something like that. So it's interesting to kind of hear that. In addition to the boys, that woodworking and furniture making also really supported a lot of them after they left school, when they were able to kind of do it as an odd job type thing.
One of my dear friends, Peter Ernick, he went to residential school as well. He's Inuit, and he was swept up. He was a little older. My mom was 6 and stayed until she was 13, and then her mother was dying, and so she was sent home to look after the little kids. And because I guess they figured they had trained her well enough at that point. PETA, he was swept up when the Inuit kids were swept up, so he was a bit older. But that's one thing he's always said is you know, they taught me, if nothing else, they taught me how to build and to fix things, and so I came away with a skill. And so it's a very, very mixed feelings, because he was also not treated very well in the school, so very mixed feelings.
So it looks like Erin has their hand raised. So Erin, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, everybody. This was a really great presentation. I was really excited to see the art. So for people who don't know, I'm working on a project on the Indian hospitals and particularly the treatment of tuberculosis in the segregated hospitals and sanatoriums. So there's unsurprisingly so many similarities between what you have talked about here and what was happening in the hospitals and sanatoriums. They're really sort of the same side, two sides of the same coin. So my project is specifically focused around photography and photographs of Indigenous staff and patients in the hospitals. A lot of the photos that we have were taken seemingly by white photographers, probably for publicity purposes. That's something I'm hoping the archive will tell us more about once we get to return to the archives. But we also have photos that were taken by staff in particular. So I know that the archives holds a lot of photos. Do you guys have photos that were taken by students?
So we do, but not for the Shingwauk Residential School. Particularly the residential school that was in Spanish Ontario had a photography club and a photo lab. And many of those photos that we hold, like there's hundreds of them that were taken by students. They provide a really different perspective on residential school life and on the students than many of the more staged photos or photos taken by staff. So for example, things like student posture is very different, where they're located is very different. The fact that there's a lot of photos of just individual students, which is something you don't see a lot of in most of the other photos. They're mostly groups. Yeah, they're a really interesting piece, and I think actually go really well with this conversation around agency and artwork and materials that have been created by students, because it is a very different context.
Yeah, I think looking comparatively at the student more candid photographs and the ones that were created at Shingwauk, a lot of the photos center around events or center around classes, and the students are often in a group doing something, that would be considered educational or productive. And they were often appearing with a staff member who was posed in such a way that they were looking helpful or kind. Whereas if you were looking at photographs at the Spanish residential school, like Krista said, like they wouldn't be standing straight up, they would be slouched. They would be kind of just all hanging out or playing sports or like just doing something for them. And there wouldn't be too often staff in those photos. Even looking at some of the photos for this art talk, ones that I was interested in looking at, because Krista and I had been working on a separate piece about this very discussion. There were photographs of the art club at Shingwauk, and it was often kind of staged of them like looking at the camera while they're like painting and like staring back at the camera, like some very, very posed, very careful photographs as opposed to something a little bit more candid.
I think even looking at it from the photography perspective, the fact that those negatives were all hand cut by students and things, so they're not mass produced, is really interesting. Similar to how the sketches in the artwork are more individual and they're flawed in certain ways because they were created by students, which I think is beautiful.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to add that to my to-do list to get in touch and look at those photos. Thank you for this.
If there's any other questions, feel free to put it into the chat or to raise your hand. Yeah.
Sorry, don't have a mouse with me, so I can't raise my hand, but I would like to ask a question if I may. I'll also put my video on. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you, first of all, for this presentation. It was fascinating. And so you mentioned that a lot of the, especially woodwork items, were sold to partially fund the operations of the school. Do you happen to know sort of the percentage of of the school's operating budget that came from those sales, or do you happen to know whether the proceeds from those sales were used for, particular projects or materials for the school's operation?
Art sales themselves weren't like a huge source of income. They were more so done for specific, like they were put into a pot for like many things like maintenance, repairs, buying extra school supplies, buying food, different things like transportation costs. The bulk of the money actually, I think, came from the fact that the students grew their own food and would sell excess produce to the community, as well as, like some of those furniture sales, I think would have probably accounted for a little bit more money than the craft and bazaar sales.
Thank you.
I muted myself. Whoops. What? Looks like we have a question from Jess. So Jess, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this super interesting presentation. So I'm working with Crystal Fraser and a group of survivors and intergenerational survivors on recreation at residential schools in the Northwest Territories. And one of the things that we're looking at right now, and I don't know if I really have a question, but I just thought I'm just going to float this little boat out into the pond and see if you have any thoughts or ideas. One of the sources that we're looking at, because we're really trying to access students' experiences at schools here, and we are interviewing survivors, but are sort of curious what's out in the sort of documentary record. And so we're looking at yearbooks from schools. So those are mostly from the 50s onwards here. So a much later period, not much later, but a later period in sort of the history of residential schooling. And some of what you were saying was interesting to me today, because there's artwork in yearbooks, there's poems and stories, there's photography. They are, to some degree, and I'm not sure we could put a percentage on it, created by students themselves. They have yearbook committees. There's often a staff advisor for those. And when I look at some of the introductions to the books, it sort of sounds like principals would have reviewed them before they got printed. So there's many, many layers, but I'm just sort of curious, I guess, yearbooks. Any thoughts, have you worked with these in terms of the Shingwauk schools or others in your region? Thank you so much again for the presentation, and any thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jess. That's a really good question. We do have a number of yearbooks. Most of them aren't specific to Shingwauk, but there are a lot for the Spanish residential schools, as well as Poplar Hill, Sterling Lake, and Crystal Lake. Some more northwestern Ontario, as well as some in Western Canada that were maintained by the Grey Nuns. We've got a bunch of yearbook collections from them. And you're right, there is a lot of artwork, particularly sketches done by students in those. I don't think that's something we've actually had a really good conversation about. Often, the materials that are from Northwestern Ontario were donated by survivors. So I think the context of how they came to us is a little different, whereas the materials that came from the Grey Nuns came from that archive directly. So I think there's some unpacking to do there around the context of how these came to us. They've never been on display so far. They have been digitized and they're stored in our archive in a respectful way, but I don't know around conversations, Storm, if you have any thoughts on the care and use of yearbooks.
Yeah, yearbooks, I think we utilized those in relation to Spanish a few times because a lot of students that I had relationships with or that I knew within the Algoma Sault Ste. Marie community, they had ancestors that went to both Shingwauk and Spanish, either just through marriage or just multiple ancestors sent to different schools in the area. So utilizing those, a lot of times it was to try to find out where and when a particular person was in school. But those I found, yeah, they were heavily edited just as like what was said earlier. They were reviewed. A lot of the letters, as well as poetry, a lot of the event photography looks like it was more so focused on what the students were doing in relation to school, rather than expression. It looks like a lot of the drawings were like, you know, who created the best art in art class this year, or hey, can you draw something for the yearbook? And they would be given kind of like an idea or a concept. But utilizing those, I found, yeah, we're more so for the later on survivors. So from those who were in the 50s, 60s onwards. And that was a very different experience as far as like art and things would go in residential schools. I know for Shingwauk, as well as Spanish pre-1950s or even the late 1940s, there wasn't as much freedom of expression involved in the curriculum and in the programming of residential schools in our particular region anyway. Oh, and to talk a little bit about artwork that ended up being moved. I know, Krista, we have some items in the collection that was collected by various staff or principals from different residential schools in Canada. So we have some beaded items and some embroidered items that actually come, I believe, from Alberta, and ended up at the Shingwauk Residential School via the principal, whose brother was working as the principal of another school, and would often use those items created as gifts for his family. And they would get moved around from school to school, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to try to figure out who created those or what context they were created under when they're from a completely different institution and we have no idea how they ended up there. We just kind of pieced it together from the records that were available.
I know that's one thing we've always advocated, that if we were able to locate like the original maker or community that beadwork or embroidery was from, we'd be happy to return it. It's just in many cases, there's not that context around it to facilitate that, unfortunately.
There's a question asking if we have a favorite piece of art.
I know for me, there's a few items in the Harvey Owl collection that are favorites of mine, especially his wildlife drawings.
I was going to say the tiger.
Yeah, the tiger's really nice. I also really like the polar bear because it's kind of hanging out on an ice floe and the sun's setting in the background, and it's a very colorful piece, as well as those items that I just mentioned from Alberta. There's a few beaded scissor holders, which I thought were really intricate, as well as just like the coloring of them is so beautiful. And it kind of just speaks to, like, you know, I know a lot of present day friends in the Algoma region who utilize those types of things, who have beaded scissor holders or who have beaded bags that they keep their crafting supplies in, and it's kind of cool to have that that connection.
That's a good question, Jay. Storm, do you know what age Harvey Owl was when he created the artwork?
I know that he was between the ages of about 9 and 15 when he created the different pieces of artwork that are in the collection, which is pretty phenomenal when you see the picture, like some of the hockey photos and some of the wildlife collection. It's extremely detailed, and you can tell that it's a lot of like natural talent. Yeah, it was really amazing, especially the faces of a lot of the people that he drew were very realistic. So you have to imagine, like, he's not a trained artist. He's a young man at a residential school, and looking, just, I guess, creating those off of either hockey cards or television. or even newspapers. It must have been just like purely talent. So what did Harvey do after he left the school? That's a little bit more of a difficult story. From what I gathered from his family, Harvey was one of the folks who had a difficult time in school, as well as adjusting to life after he was finished school. I spoke with a friend who's actually his great niece about kind of how he adjusted after that life, and he was actually without a home for a long period of time, and he had some difficulties in life after school, and it's unfortunate because you could see how talented he was, and if he had been given different opportunities, he probably would have been a very successful artist. Oh yeah. Did you want to talk a bit about curriculum?
You can go if you want.
Sure. We have a collection of notebooks, student notebooks, that were drawn by students kind of like in social studies class, I guess. And they actually features around the world. And that was very illuminating, kind of like a conversation of like, this is like kind of the white supremacist racist values that were being taught in schools, especially with how they were drawing people from European cultures versus people from Asian cultures versus people from African cultures. It was really interesting to see the differences, and they would write all of it the exact same form. They would draw the person on one side and color it, where there was some variation, but most of them looked the same. And then on the other side, they would all write the same paragraph, like, you know, this is Greta. Greta is from Holland. She wears wooden clogs, like just stuff like that. And it was all done the same from person to person. So art in that context was used to teach them about the world, but integrate it into a very stereotypical assimilationist idea of what type of people inhabit the world. So we used to see that quite often.
Say beyond that, it tended to depend on who was teaching at the residential school at one period or another. If a teacher had a particular passion for art, they likely would have worked that into their classes. But if you had no one who was interested in art, it simply just wasn't included.
Yeah, I found that teachers would voluntarily run the art club, the Shingwauk Art Club, which we have some photos of, I believe, from the late 50s to the late 60s. And that was just because there were two teachers there who were actually interested in spending their out of class time with students creating art or giving them art assignments, and then going to the bazaar sales to sell that art. Whereas other times there was just nothing there, and it could either be that we have a gap in those items were thrown out or misplaced or in the possession of somebody else, or records weren't kept about things that were created at that time. It may have been that they were still creating art. We just simply don't know based off of what we have.
Yeah, exactly, Sarah. It wasn't necessarily viewed as skill building, such as woodworking or needlework, which would have been included all the time. So I think we're just hitting up against 1 o'clock. Skylee-Storm, do you have anything you want to kind of close with?
I'm really thankful for the discussion here today. I like talking about the curriculum and the purposes for certain things that we still have possession of from residential school students, and kind of getting into depth of why this is so different from the main schooling system and what was created in those, because we all have memories of schooling that we were given art projects or assignments, and just doing a compare and contrast, and while these things look similar, they're actually really quite different. And I think too, it's really important to talk about the ethics of the collections that we hold of former residential schools, as well as items that come from that system. Just because, I mean, it's important to take into account the families, the descendants, the living survivors that interact with those items. And it's important to kind of integrate their voices and their feelings into how those things are preserved and displayed.
Yeah, I would agree. I think these conversations are really important, and particularly in, you know, the archives, museum field, the history field, to think about how we're accessing and displaying and using these items, I think is important.
And just to respond to a comment there in the chat about pan-indigeneity, that's of course something else I was really happy we could touch on today with this discussion, because that was one of the biggest effects I think we see of the assimilation policies of the Indian Act, as well as residential schools, with this idea of what is Indian and what isn't. And I think that this art is really great at making that connection.
All right, so we're coming up right on 1 o'clock. And if that's all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. I'd like to thank Skylee-Storm and Krista for their really informative discussion and everything that they've done to prepare for this. I am going to post in the chat a link to the National Residential School Crisis Line, just because sometimes this information can be triggering or upsetting. So if it's something you need to access, it will be in the chat right now. Thank you so much for everybody for coming out today, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Maddy. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.